It's 80 AD, and I'm standing in my mind inside the Roman Colosseum, with nearly 50,000 people roaring so loud it feels like the ground itself is shaking. Right there in the middle of the arena, I see a woman chained to a rough wooden frame, completely naked and frozen with fear. Then, without warning, they unleash a bull, not to kill her, but to do something far more disturbing. The guards had already prepared for this by building a hollow wooden cow, a crude mechanical replica meant for one purpose. They force the woman inside it and drive the bull to mount the structure, turning the act into a spectacle for the crowd. This isn't just punishment. It's an execution, carefully disguised as mythology. They frame it as the story of Pasiphae, the queen who, according to legend, slept with a bull. The crowd claps like it's a show. Kids stare without looking away. Senators laugh like they're at a dinner party. This is Roman entertainment. And no, this isn't some made-up horror story. It actually happened. The poet Martial was there at the Colosseum's grand opening, and he wrote about what he saw. He recorded the moment, saying he witnessed Pasiphae joined with the bull. A myth became something real under Caesar's rule, witnessed and preserved in writing. This was Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever known. They gave us laws, aqueducts, philosophy, and somehow turned public sexual violence into family-friendly amusement. Today, I'm going to walk you through the most brutal, twisted, and inhuman spectacles that Rome ever staged inside the arena. These are things Hollywood won't touch and your teachers probably never mentioned, even though the Romans themselves documented them in detail. Because this wasn't chaos or insanity. This was politics. This was propaganda. This was control. And every bit of it was completely legal. I'm Crown and Dagger, and here there's no censorship. Only the truth Rome would rather you forget. Pay attention to how people talk about the Colosseum. Whenever people talk about the Colosseum, they always bring up brave gladiators and heroic fights. But they never tell you this part. Every week, here on Crown and Dagger, I dig up the darkest stories history would rather keep buried. If you want history without filters, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next only gets more violent and harder to perception. From the 1st to the 4th century AD, Rome ruled over roughly 60 million people, making it the largest empire humanity had ever seen. And no matter where you went in Roman territory, every major city shared one feature: an arena. There were more than 250 amphitheaters spread across the empire. The Colosseum alone could seat 50,000 people, and most days, every seat was filled. Here's what you need to understand. This wasn't chaotic or accidental violence. It was death on an industrial scale. The historian Eutropius estimated that more than 400,000 people were killed in Roman arenas over 4 centuries. That's an entire city wiped out purely for entertainment. When the Colosseum first opened, Emperor Titus celebrated with 100 straight days of games. 9,000 animals were slaughtered during that stretch. That's about 90 deaths a day, just for fun. Later, after conquering Daia, Emperor Trajan held games that lasted 123 days. 10,000 gladiators fought. Thousands of prisoners were executed. The philosopher Seneca attended these events and wrote something that still sends chills down my spine. He said he came home more greedy, more cruel, and more inhuman, simply because he had been among other humans. He watched the midday executions, criminals tied to posts, lions released, and crowds gambling on how long each victim would scream before dying. That was lunchtime entertainment. So why did Rome do this? Because the arena achieved something no other institution could. It taught obedience through pleasure. When you watch a man get torn apart, you learn exactly what happens to Rome's enemies. When you cheer as someone dies, you become part of it. And that shared guilt, that complicity, was the whole point. According to historian Cassius Dio, Rome spent more money on arena games than on roads, schools, or hospitals. By the 2nd century AD, they had fully developed supply chains, lions shipped in from Africa, criminals transported from Gaul, Christians dragged in from Judea. Everything was organized, scheduled, and funded. Death was packaged as entertainment and delivered daily to a population addicted to brutality. What you just heard, that was the system. Now I want to show you what actually happened down in the sand. The spectacles that made 50,000 people cheer while human dignity died right in front of them. And it all started at a funeral, with blood. In 264 BC, 3 sons wanted to honor their dead father, not with prayers, but with violence. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and forced them to fight to the death in the forum. This happened in a cattle market, thick with the stench of manure and smoke. This wasn't entertainment yet. It was called munus, a duty owed to the dead. The tradition came from Rome's enemies, the Campanians and Samnites. They believed restless spirits needed blood to find peace. But Rome's elites saw something different. They saw power. A funeral with bloodshed showed wealth. A funeral with spectacular bloodshed showed dominance. By the 3rd century BC, politicians had turned funeral games into campaign tools. The Senate called it religious devotion. The crowd knew better. It was politics. Even the armor told a story. The Samnite gladiator wore equipment designed to look like Rome's defeated enemies, turning every strike into a reenactment of Roman conquest. Each blow reminded the crowd who had won and who had been crushed. Death itself became propaganda. What started with temporary wooden seating eventually turned into massive stone amphitheaters, permanent monuments to violence. These places weren't just buildings. They were temples where death repeated the same message over and over again. Rome controls men, armies, and even death itself. If funeral games were the beginning, what followed transformed the arena into Rome's most ruthless spectacle. Rome learned something important along the way. Exotic suffering drew bigger crowds than ordinary death. Lions were hauled in from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles dragged up from the Nile, and giraffes forced across endless deserts. These animals weren't presented as marvels of the world. They were sentenced to die, treated as prey in a massive carnival of slaughter. The Romans called these shows Venationes, or hunts. But they weren't hunts at all. They were executions of nature itself. Julius Caesar set the standard in 46 BC when he paraded a giraffe through Rome, the first one most Europeans had ever seen. They didn't even have a proper name for it, so they called it a camelopardalus. It didn't matter what they called it. The animal was eventually thrown into the sand to be ripped apart. The message was clear. If Rome could capture the strangest creatures on earth, then nothing was beyond its reach. And the slaughter only escalated. At the Colosseum's grand opening, Emperor Titus oversaw the killing of more than 9,000 animals during a single festival. Archaeologists later found animal bones marked with signs of intentional starvation. Lions and bears were weakened ahead of time to guarantee fast, violent deaths. Behind the scenes, the logistics were merciless. Caravans dragged cages across burning deserts. Ships floated living cargo down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives delivering breathing trophies to a city that demanded fresh blood every single day. Pliny the Elder warned that rare species were disappearing from their native lands. Lions, leopards, and elephants were being driven toward extinction. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death. It was an ecological wrecking ball. Animal massacres pulled in crowds, but Rome always wanted more. They wanted tension. They wanted imbalance. They wanted fights where the outcome was fixed, but the suffering was real. They wanted theater disguised as combat. When people picture gladiators today, they imagine 2 evenly matched warriors battling it out. The reality was far more twisted. Rome thrived on unfairness, contests carefully engineered for cruelty. Prisoners and criminals were pushed into the arena, dressed like fools, handed wooden weapons, and sent to face trained killers. The crowd mocked them as they panicked, stumbled, and died. It was public execution pretending to be sport. Even the weapons played roles. The retiarius fought with a fisherman's net and a trident, matched against the secutor, whose helmet was specifically designed to block the net. It wasn't about skill. It was about suspense. Would the net trap its target, or would the blade break through first? Sometimes one man was forced to face several opponents at once. Other times, entire groups clashed, turning the arena floor into a swamp of blood and broken bodies. The helmets themselves were tools of suffering. Some restricted vision so badly that fighters staggered around half-blind while the audience laughed. Others were so heavy that simply lifting the head became torture. The armor wasn't meant to protect, it was meant to punish. Gladiators were dressed as barbarians and forced to reenact Rome's victories, dying again and again for a cheering crowd. Rome's defeated enemies. Their loss was never in doubt, and that certainty reminded everyone watching that the empire always wins. Unbalanced fights were vicious, but even that wasn't the worst of it, because Rome kept a special category of victims. These people weren't meant to fight at all. They were meant to die loudly, painfully, and in a way that made the crowd laugh. By midday, the arena stopped pretending to be about combat and turned fully into theater, with death as the main attraction. The Romans called it Damnatio ad Bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Criminals, deserters, slaves, prisoners of war. They were forced into roles and executions dressed up as myths. Every punishment fit the crime. Thieves were ripped apart by wolves, arsonists were burned alive, traitors were thrown to lions. Each scene was a twisted morality play, written in real blood. The animals were prepared for maximum horror. Lions were starved until they went mad. Bears were kept chained in pits, stabbed and prodded, until rage took over. The uncertainty, whether the beast would kill quickly or play with its victim, kept the crowd screaming for more. After Emperor Trajan conquered Dia, thousands of captives were slaughtered over 123 days of games. This wasn't chaos. It was carefully paced, staged like acts in a play. Every death was designed to hold attention, to keep the audience on edge. The historian Strauss wrote about victims tied to stakes while wild bulls were released. The animals, trained to attack movement, gored prisoners as the crowd bet on how long each person would scream before dying. This wasn't justice. It was entertainment pretending to be moral. Stop for a second and think about this. 4 spectacles in, thousands dead, animals wiped out, human beings reduced to props. And if you think this is the worst Rome ever did, you're wrong. Because what came next is where execution stopped being about death and became pure sadistic theater. For the condemned, dying wasn't enough. They had to perform their own deaths, acting out Rome's myths with their bodies. Prisoners were forced to play doomed heroes. Orpheus, the musician who, in legend, charmed wild animals with his music. In myth, the beasts sat peacefully. In the arena, a bear was released mid-performance and tore the singer apart. The poet Martial witnessed it and wrote, "We saw Orpheus." Had he delayed, the beasts might have obeyed. But instead, he was ripped to pieces. Another man was forced to play Daedalus. They strapped crude wings to his body and lifted him above the arena. For a brief moment, he flew. Then he fell straight into the beasts below. Martial joked that the man must have wished for real feathers. And then there was the most grotesque spectacle of all, Pasiphae and the bull. One show staged her assault using a mechanical beast, followed by a brutal mauling that erased any line between execution, humiliation, and pornography. Tertullian recorded that female prisoners were sometimes dressed as priestesses, sexually violated in front of the crowd, and then killed. The message was unmistakable. Rome owned its myths the same way it owned people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None of them were safe from being rewritten as disposable props in a festival of death. For the condemned, it meant slow, agonizing ends hidden behind costumes. For Rome, it was propaganda made flesh. Everything so far happened on land, inside a normal arena. But Rome wasn't satisfied. They asked a new question. What if we flooded the arena? What if we dragged the ocean into the desert and made men die at sea? Mock naval battles, naumachii, were spectacles on a scale so insane that even water became a weapon. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar dug a massive basin near the Tiber, filled it with water, and launched ships into it. Thousands of captives were shoved aboard and ordered to fight as rival fleets. They weren't actors. They were men sentenced to die for applause. Arrows, catapults, steel, slaughter floating on water. Augustus took it further. In 2 BC, he built a basin nearly 2,000 feet long, fed by a custom aqueduct just to keep it full. 30 warships clashed, packed with prisoners who were never meant to leave alive. The message was clear. Rome could command seas where none existed. Even nature bowed to imperial will. By 52 AD, Emperor Claudius drained Lake Fucine just to stage another naval massacre. When the captives saluted him with "Morituri te salutant," those who are about to die salute you, history gained one of its most chilling lines. Even the Colosseum itself had channels to flood the floor for naval shows, then drain it for combat the next day. Cruelty became an engineering challenge, and the arena never stopped evolving. As the empire aged, the spectacles only grew more depraved. This is where Rome crossed every remaining line. Women were forced to fight, sometimes naked, sometimes against dwarfs or wild animals. The satirist Juvenal mocked them, but records show the fights were real. Their presence blurred gender roles but reinforced a darker truth. No one was beyond Rome's appetite for spectacle. Prisoners were dressed in pitch-soaked shirts and set on fire. Tertullian bitterly called them living torches. These weren't executions. They were warnings carved into living flesh. Men and women burned as smoke rose into the air, while vendors sold wine and children played nearby. Borrowed from the east, staged in the heart of Rome, people nailed to wooden beams while the crowd ate lunch. Death wasn't quick. It lasted hours, sometimes days, and the audience watched every moment. Even emperors would eventually step into the arena themselves. Then there was Comiotus, the ultimate showman. He marched into the Colosseum dressed as Hercules himself, putting on a performance that was part cosplay, part massacre. He slaughtered hundreds of animals, most of them crippled beforehand, so there was never any real danger. He fought gladiators too, but only when every advantage was stacked in his favor. Losing wasn't an option. Applause wasn't a choice. It was mandatory. According to the historian Cassius Dio, Commodus fought as a gladiator 735 times. Each one of those staged victories cost the Roman treasury 1,000,000 sesterces. The empire paid dearly just to watch its emperor pretend to be invincible. Christians who refused to renounce their faith were fed to lions, burned alive, or crucified as mass entertainment. Their deaths were reshaped into spectacles meant to please the crowd. These weren't executions in the normal sense. They were public relations campaigns, designed to crush any belief system that dared challenge Rome's authority. By now, we've covered 11 different spectacles and hundreds of thousands of deaths. So which one was the most depraved? The mythological executions where people performed their own deaths? The living torches? The naval battles? Drop your answer in the comments because I want to know. At what point does entertainment cross the line and become evil? So what happened after centuries of this? By the late Empire, Rome was spending more money on arena games than on its own military. More on spectacles than on roads, defenses, or infrastructure. Not everyone was cheering. Seneca admitted the executions hardened him. He wrote that he came home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, simply because he had been among other people. Violence didn't stay inside the arena walls. It leaked into everyday life. For Christians, the amphitheater became both persecution and proof. Tertullian called the games seeds of cruelty, accusing an empire that applauded injustice and called it sport. Economically, the games consumed entire fortunes. Rulers bankrupted themselves, trying to outdo their predecessors with ever more extravagant shows. Culturally, the hunger for spectacle dulled Rome's edge. Citizens who once valued discipline and duty now demanded cheap bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this decay with the phrase panem et circenses. That craving for constant entertainment showed just how far Rome had drifted from its roots. As borders collapsed and money dried up, the arenas began to fall apart. By the 5th century, the Colosseum stood empty, its sand quiet, its crowds gone, its roar reduced to silence. And the question remained, could a society that trained its people to enjoy suffering really survive? History's answer was no. If this story turned your stomach but you couldn't stop listening, hit like now, because that tells me these unfiltered stories are exactly what you want. And if you want me to dig up more grotesque secrets history books like to hide, subscribe. Every week, there's another historical nightmare waiting. Today, the Colosseum still looms over Rome, scarred but proud. Walk through its tunnels and you might almost hear it. Iron clashing, beasts roaring, 50,000 voices screaming in unison. The stone is easy to admire. What's harder is remembering what it was built for. Cruelty, practiced over and over until it felt normal. Rome's arenas were never just about blood. They were about control, shaping how people thought, laughed, and obeyed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth reborn in screams served a single purpose: to make power look eternal. That's the warning carved into the ruins. A civilization that glorifies violence will eventually collapse under the weight of its own applause. And Rome wasn't the only empire to turn death into entertainment. There's another civilization that did something even more twisted with human sacrifice. Watch the video on your screen now. I'll see you in the next nightmare.